Hi everybody, it's crazy. It's Sunday. It's time for the UPBGE video of the week. Now before I get started, gotta give a shout out to my trusted because you guys rock. To my crazy fam, I love you guys. Now we're up to episode number 142 and we ended chapter 8 last week. So let's go on over to chapter 9, which is publishing and beyond. So we left off with the file of culling.blend, which there is no file for this one. This is just basically knowing how to publish your game out. So I'm just going to leave it on this so you don't have to see me boringly read from the white page. So let's get started. Alright, you've made it this far. By now you should have a solid understanding of everything it takes to make a game. Now the question is, how do you get that game into the hands of the public? This chapter will focus on publishing the game, including how to package your game using the standalone Blender player and understanding the licensing issues related to using Blender. We will also explore alternatives to the Blender game engine while still using Blender as the main content creation tool. Even though this is a Blender-specific book, we encourage you to familiarize yourself with other game engines and to understand their pros and cons so you can decide for yourself what is the best publishing platform to use for a particular game. And getting ready for publishing. You finished your game. Now what? Apart from stress testing, promoting, and polishing it, there are a few technical things you need to do in order to deploy your project. They apply to almost any of the options discussed in this chapter, and even if you are using external engines, you should take them into consideration. Resources. Generally speaking, for other users to run a game created by Blender, they will need all of the following files. The Blender file. This is a .blend file that contains your 3D scene and game logic. Resources. These include image textures, audio, fonts, and scripts. Blender binary or executable. This can be the Blender or Blender player binary that is needed to run the game for people who do not already have Blender installed. This list is simplified. For example, in a larger project, instead of a single Blender file, a game could be composed of multiple Blender files. But there will always be one file that acts as an entry point to start the game. Resources are external files that are used in the game. Resources can be packed, which basically copies these files into the Blender file. Finally, the Blender binary is also not usually a single file. It contains libraries and scripts that Blender will need. It is usually a good idea to include the binary with the release because unless the game is distributed exclusively within the Blender community, the user probably will not have Blender or the current version of Blender installed to run the Blender file. Okay, so just make sure that if you're going to do it, include the binary because not everybody has Blender and not everybody uses the same version of Blender. I use 0.2.0, some people use 0.3, some people use the new 0.4, you name it. So keep that in mind as you go along. Okay, the theory of relativity. The first rule of deployment is to remember that because we have no control over the user's computer, which you don't want, it is impossible to predict where the game will be installed. If that's not bad enough, different operating systems, Windows, Mac, Linux, handle file paths differently. The only way to ensure capability across different systems is to make sure all file paths used in the game are relative and nested to the root folder of your game. Some relative paths: //textures /color.png. Okay, it's because your color is going to be in your textures file. Okay, // audio / music / background.mp3, which will be in your audio file, which would be in the music folder, which will be your file. Okay, some bad relative paths. // dot // fonts / comic sans.ttf. That's not a good way to do it. Don't put periods in. Periods are not good. // dot / downloads / textures / floor.png. Okay, again, those periods are going to cause a lot of havoc. Keep them in a relative folder, and you'll only have to need to use is /. Some absolute paths, avoid them. Okay, C:\users /documents /Peter /my Blender project /textures /color.png, or /home /desktop /downloaded from the from internet /audio /music /background.mp3. As you can see, not only does an absolute file path reveal a lot of things you probably don't want others to see, but an absolute file path simply won't work on another computer unless it has the same folder setup as you and a compatible operating system. So in other words, if they have users documents Peter, then guess what? It might work. They also have to have my Blender project and / textures. So you got to have all those in order to make this absolute path work. Same thing with the other one, home, desktop, downloaded from the internet. Most people are going to have downloaded from the internet. You may have, but not everybody else will. Okay. Let's see. Yeah. By default, Blender references all external assets such as image textures, audio files, and linked Blender files using a relative path. The file path is always relative to the Blender file. So it would be in, within that Blender file. Okay, wherever that Blender file is, hopefully you put it in your name game, and that's where the Blender file is. You're going to look for that one, and then everything in that will go from there. Okay? Because all relative paths are relative to the current open Blender file. In order for the relative path to work, the Blender file should be saved before an external assets are loaded. Okay? If you are using Python scripts to load a file from the computer, you should always use the OS module, os.path.sep, okay, or os.path.join. Okay, so separate, join, if you're wondering what that is, to handle these file locations. It's never too late to make it right. If you forgot to save your file before appending assets, or miss the relative path option in the load menu, don't worry. There is an option in the file menu that helps rearrange the assets file paths. File, external data, make all paths relative. Okay, so you go to your, I'm gonna come up here, go up here to file, okay, then go down to external data, which is right here, okay, and then you're gonna click on, where's it? Make all paths relative. Don't choose this option, okay? If you make it absolute, it's going to cause you problems. Don't do it. Make them relative, and that will help you out later in the long, okay? Packing. If you don't want to deal with external files, Blender also offers another helpful tool to simplify the distribution of the game packing. Packing makes the Blender file itself sufficient by collecting all external assets such as images, sounds, and fonts into the current Blender file. To pack a file, click on File, External Data again, okay, and then pack into .blend file, okay, which is right here, okay. And if you accidentally did it and you screwed up and you forgot to put something in, you can go unpack, okay, put it in, and then put it back, okay. Shouldn't be too hard. Needless to say, packing will make the Blender file increase in size. Packing is a very crude way to hide the file structure of your game from visual observers, but in no way does packing ensure the security of these files. It is easy for someone to unpack the files and have access to the entire game asset you created. Packing is a convenient tool, not an encryption method. Okay? If you're paranoid that somebody's going to steal your artwork or something like that, you'll want to encrypt it. You don't want to just pack it. Okay? Packing it is not a secure way of housing your stuff. Okay? Unpacking does not reverse. It does unpacking does the reverse of packing. It takes all the packed data from the Blender file and writes them out as separate files. For the lazy and unorganized, when you start a project, use external data from wherever on your computer, with no regard to its location. When you feel like getting organized, simply do a pack operation and then immediately follow it with an unpack operation. With the unpack to current directory option, okay, so what it's going to talk about is when you do this and you hit this, it's going to give you an option to unpack it somewhere else, okay? And it's going to say the current directory. So if you pack your file up and you put it in, you had it in C program dot whatever, and you don't really want it there, you can unpack it, okay, or move it to somewhere, unpack it there, okay, and then pack it up with current directory option, okay. This will first pack all the images into the Blender and then unpack them neatly into a directory called textures. This way, there is no need to manually move stuff around. All the external data used will be automatically moved to the single folder for easy distribution. Images in their original locations are untouched. Okay? Blender Player. Let's see, how far are we getting in? Yeah, I've only got 16 pages to go with this. We're looking at about 11 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and end it here because I don't want to go too far into the Blender Player because, yeah, it starts on a different page, so we can continue on from there next week. So let me switch back to here, and then we can go from that page, and I'm going to show it to you real quick, okay, which is page 4 at the very bottom, but it's also at the very top of page 5. I'm just going to say top of page 5. Okay, so that way you know next week that if, when I say page 5, it's going to be the very, very tip top of page 5, the Blender Player, next week. Till then.